Good evening. My name is Mohsen Milani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. On behalf of our center and the College of Arts and Sciences and our university, I welcome all of you to this special program about U.S.-Iran relations. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, let me say a few words about our center. Our center was established about 8 years ago, and it has evolved to become a major hub for research and information about national security challenges the United States faces today. We have organized in the past 8 years 11 major conferences, and I have held over 40 one-to-one conversations with the most prominent thinkers, including some major academics and policymakers. Also, the center has been able to have a number of students as interns, and we are very lucky to have a number of very talented graduate students working in our center. In fact, two of the people who have helped organize this conference today, Mr. Arman Mohammadi, who has produced the program, and Mr. Arman Mahmoudian, are extremely talented, and they're working on their graduate degrees. The center has been blessed to receive financial support from the university, but it has also received generous support from private donors, especially from the board members of our advisory board. I'd like to acknowledge Judge Raymond Gross, former provost of our university, Dr. David Stamps, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Holbrook, Mr. Wilhite, Mr. Sam Bell, Mr. Charlie Stryker, and Mr. Gene Engel for their generous contribution to the center. If any of you are rich enough or interested enough and would like to make some tax-free contributions, do not feel guilty at all. We'll accept it. Just go to our website or send your email address, go to the chat portion of the screen, send your email, and I'll be more than happy to get in touch with you about your possible contribution. Tonight's conversation is about U.S.-Iran's tortured relations and the lessons that we can learn from it. We have a distinguished guest who is a prolific writer. Mr. Malcolm Byrne is the Director of Research at the Non-Governmental National Security Archive, where he has directed the U.S.-Iran Research Project, a multinational archival exploration of the topic. He has authored a number of books. 3 of his books are absolutely fantastic. I encourage anybody who is a serious student of Iranian politics and Iranian foreign and security policies to consult those books, because those books are not based on newspaper clippings. They are based on declassified U.S. government documents. He has written and co-authored a book about U.S.-Iran relations during the war. His second book is about the Iran-Contra affairs, Reagan scandals, and the unchecked abuse of presidential power. And his third book is World Apart, a documentary history of U.S.-Iran relations. And his fourth book is upcoming soon. It is called The Narrative Trap, America and Iran's Clash of Civilization. For your information, I have purchased all his books. I usually go to the archives of his center. And again, if you're interested in serious research, I would advise you to take a look at that archive. We will have a surprise guest. I'm not going to tell you who that guest is. I will introduce him in about 40 minutes into our program. Please, ladies and gentlemen, join me to welcome Mr. Malcolm Byrne to USF.
Thank you.
Malcolm, I don't know if you remember where you and I met first. I think it must have been at least 15, 16 years ago, if not more, in a Washington conference. And I was blessed. I was lucky to sit right next to you during the lunch. And you started asking me questions about what I do. And I started asking questions about what you do. And you told me that you're working or you have worked on a project on the Iran-Contra affairs that took place during the Reagan presidency. And I immediately told you, have you seen this particular book written in Persian about the affairs? And you said no. I said, would you like to see it? And you gave me your address, and I sent that to you. I have to confess that you kept it much longer than I was expecting, but
I think I still have it.
Yes, but there it was, my first encounter with you. And since then, it has been a great pleasure. In fact, a great honor to know you and to read your scholarship and to learn from your wisdom and your vast knowledge about what the U.S. has been doing in Iran. So welcome to this conversation.
That's very kind. And I do still have the book. I remember it very well. And I guess our relationship could only go up from there. But for me, it's a great honor to be part of this program, which has had so many truly distinguished people as guests. So I look forward to it.
Thank you very much. If you agree, in the next 35 to 40 minutes, I would like to challenge you, ask some probing questions about 4 seminal events that I believe has shaped and defined the tortured and troubled relations between the Islamic Republic of Iran, in fact, between Iran and the United States. I'm going to start with perhaps one of the most controversial events that took place back in 1953, when an aging Iranian prime minister by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the British-controlled Iranian oil industry and severed diplomatic relations with Britain, and created one of the major crises of modern Middle East. His short tenure came to an end when he was overthrown. Now, I am trying to be fair. His supporters argue that he was overthrown by a CIA MI6 staged coup d'etat, and his opponents argue that there was a coup attempt by the US and the CIA and the British, but that coup failed, and then it was an uprising by Iranian patriots who overthrew Mossadegh and returned Shah from Rome to Iran. Now, based on your analysis of the available data, US government documents, would you say that what we had in Iran was a classical case of a coup, or was it something else?
Well, it is really one of the kind of granddaddies of all kind of conspiracies and events that remain controversial, as you've said. And it always amazes me. I've been looking at this affair on and off for many years now, and it never ceases to amaze me how few basic facts everybody can agree on. You can basically agree that it happened in August of 1953, that there were Iranian and American and even British elements involved. Mossadegh was the target, the Shah was involved. But I'm not really exaggerating that beyond that, there is really very little that everybody can agree on. And what is also strange and entertaining if you're a historian and you don't have a stake in this particularly, is to see how as more information comes out, you feel like you know even less. There's even less that is for certain because different facts and reputed facts come out from different quarters. And you feel less confident in pronouncing a final word on any aspect of it.
So based, again, I want to go back to the question and push you. Based on what you have seen, I know we can have lots of more documents released later on, but quite a bit has been released by the CIA, by the US government, by the British. Documentaries have been made, books have been written. You wrote one. Uh, Based on those, as of today, and you can, of course, as a scientist, you can change your mind as you are given more facts. But based on what you know as of now, would you consider what happened a coup, or was it a uprising organized by pro-Shah elements in Iran?
To me, it was a coup. The American participants call it a counter coup because they claim that Mossadegh essentially engineered the original coup against the Shah. And that's one of the, excuse me, one of those areas where there's just a great deal that is very murky, and it's on the Iranian side, so I don't feel like I can really say a lot about that. But to me, there is no question whatsoever that this was an event that was sparked, coordinated, encouraged, and to a large degree engineered by American and British intelligence. Were there Iranians involved? Was there even a significant Iranian role? Absolutely. There's no question about it. My co-author and I, Mark Gazarowski, who is really the main expert on the American side of the coup, we edited a book on Mossadegh, on the coup, and we came to the conclusion, the two of us, that this was something that could not have happened without both sides participating in some form or another. But I think we both agree that the external forces, the CIA and MI6, were more important overall.
I think this issue is important because if you talk to any Iranian expert, they will tell you whether they believe it was a coup or it was a rebellion. They'll tell you that was the beginning, the opening salvo toward the Islamic Revolution of 1979, because right or wrong, many Iranian nationalists, Iranian leftists, and any Iranian who was in favor of Iranian sovereignty and independence were upset with the blatant intervention by foreign powers in Iran's internal affairs. Now, I want to fast forward to 1979. Enough of history. I want to go back to 1979. In December of 1978, Jimmy Carter went to Tehran, and in the Shah's palace, he praised the Shah and said something to the effect that I praise you, Your Majesty, for having created an island of stability in one of the more troubled regions of the world. And then 52 weeks later, we had a revolution, one of the most popular revolutions of the modern time. The Shah was overthrown, and Iran and the US, who were former allies, became new enemies. The US role in the last year or so of the Shah's rule is controversial. Some Iranian monarchists have gone so far as to suggest that Jimmy Carter really wanted to overthrow the Shah. I don't subscribe to that school. But the question I have for you is that would you tell us a little bit about the mindset of American decision makers in the last year of the revolution and why they pursued a policy that ultimately failed?
Well, it is a fascinating story, and it's one that can be approached from many angles. The presidential decision-making angle, the advisory process, the United States role in the world, the effect of the Cold War on U.S. policy at that time, and then the rise of Islam and how that completely threw the Americans for a loop. My conclusion, based on a reading of the documents for a number of years, is that the U.S. was still very much in the thrall of the Cold War, and they continued to be for a number of years after that, which means that virtually every decision, every action, every policy was framed against the backdrop of the rivalry with the Soviet Union. I think it is probably hard for people nowadays to imagine that, but how deeply ingrained that was in the minds of policymakers. But You can see it in the documents, especially from someone like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor to Carter. Everything is about the Soviets. What impact will this have? If we move away from the Shah at any point, it will send a bad signal, and the Russians will be encouraged by this. It's all about Moscow and this fear, which they had going back to 1953. That was one of their main reasons for mounting the coup, was to prevent the Soviets from what they believed was a possibly imminent move into Iran, political, military, or otherwise. So that was one of the things that was overshadowing American policymakers at the time. Another was that I think is very interesting and doesn't get enough attention was, if you remember what was happening on the American political scene at that point and where Carter played a role. We had just come through the mid-1970s where the post-Vietnam order of things had resulted in a lot of reforms on the side of Congress that were aimed at rolling back what they called the imperial presidency, keeping the president in check. This was Richard Nixon, of course, and his aide, Henry Kissinger. It was designed to try to move America away from dealing with dictators, dancing with dictators, as they called it, and stop being so obsessed by the Cold War, by the East-West rivalry. So here is Jimmy Carter, who ran for president on that same platform and pledged to place human rights at the center of his policy, to pull back from being the world's largest arms dealer to the world, and so on. And then he is confronted with, among other problems, the situation in Iran, which they have no idea what's going on, really, for a fact. At the policymaking levels, they didn't know literally what an Ayatollah was at that until late in the game, late in 1978. And we have some testimony from people who were at a White House briefing where that question was raised. What's an Ayatollah? Of course, talking about Khomeini. So they were operating in against a backdrop of broad ignorance, concern about the Soviets, and a president who had pledged on the one hand to sort of lay off those old realpolitik approaches and emphasize human rights and so on. And yet he discovered, and I won't go on, I'll stop after this, but he discovered that the world was not so simple. He couldn't just take that high moral approach because the situation in Iran was very complex. Iran was in such an important geostrategic position in the Middle East for reasons that are obvious. And the circumstances were not going to be resolved by a hands-off approach. And so what you see when you read the documents is Jimmy Carter ping-ponging back and forth between two different approaches. One, the Brzezinski approach, to go hard, to support the Shah no matter what. And the other, let's say, the Cyrus Vance approach from the State Department, Secretary of State, who was much more circumspect, not as worried about the Soviet role, and more attuned to local circumstances, local conditions that he and many others in the government thought needed to be addressed above all. So between those two poles, and with all these different pressures on him, including a lot of political pressure at home from supporters of the Shah, like David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and others, Carter really was at sea and didn't know how to deal with things.
Like you, Malcolm, I have studied the Iranian Revolution for 35 years, actively studied it. And one of the key questions I've always had, and you have partially answered it, and I believe you're absolutely correct, is why was it that the United States of America, having 55,000 Americans living in Iran in 1978, and having a large embassy with at least 2,000 employees, and having close relations with Iranian secret police and the military. In fact, the military was American trained and American equipped. How did they miss something that huge, a political tsunami? And I think one reason is exactly the point that you made, that Americans did not pay enough attention to what was taking place inside Iran. They looked at Iran as one chip in a card they were playing with Russia. So everything was about Russia, the Soviet Union, everything was about the Cold War. So they paid very little attention to the internal developments. And when Khomeini came along, everybody was surprised.
Right.
And that's why we've had so many conspiratorial theories about the Iranian Revolution.
Right. It is, there are many parts of the explanation for why they missed it. First of all, we should, reflect perhaps a little sadly that this is hardly a unique example, that we did not see Pearl Harbor coming. We did not see the collapse of the Soviet Union coming. We didn't foresee the Nicaraguan Revolution that happened the same year as the Iranian Revolution. Just a few days ago, Leon Panetta, former CIA director, admitted that they had no idea that the Arab Spring was on its way. So this is something that is not unique to this condition. But what explains it? A number of things explain it. One is an utter lack of fundamental information, at least on the policymaker level. I've told you that one anecdote about the Ayatollahs. So there was a lack of knowledge about Iran, first of all, and then a lack of specific information and intelligence. And part of the reason for that was because, as has been written about and spoken about by former diplomats, was that the Shah, who enjoyed a favored position with American presidents, especially Richard Nixon, because of his key role in the region, was able to make the demand that American diplomats and intelligence officers back off and not be allowed the kind of exposure to Iranian society, including dissidents and other, all sectors beyond the court, that they should rely on him and his advisor to provide information. And to an astonishing degree, the American side agreed to that. So that was one big problem. I think my co-author and I would agree on our book, Worlds Apart, which is based on declassified documents, that in fact there was a lot of pretty good information, in fact very good information available to policymakers if they had known about it and wanted to see it. But here you get into a couple of other parts of the answer. One is there is so much information out there that it's impossible for a policymaker to read, much less absorb it all. Secondly, there's a kind of a bureaucratic ceiling between the experts and the policymakers. To an extent that makes all the sense in the world. No president can be on top of every issue, can be an expert on every issue. So you rely on your experts to filter things, to find out things and filter things. So by the time you get the information, it's a smidgen of what's out there. But also your priority is much broader than theirs, your focus. If you as president have to deal with all the issues on planet Earth, and how much weight do you give to events and information coming from one percentage point of the sources that you have at your disposal? So there's that issue as well. There's another thing that is important in the Iran circumstance, which is a kind of a psychological explanation, which is the idea that people see what they want to see, believe what they want to believe. So Iran, as you say, with so many Americans living there and so many officials working there, how could this be? The Americans working there, we already have heard that they were curtailed in terms of what their freedom of movement was. So there was that problem. The 55,000 Americans were all living in a bubble, basically. Yeah. A lot of them didn't want to know what was going on. They wanted to live life as if they were back home in the United States. So they were not particularly any help as far as anybody can be told. But the prevailing attitude among American officials, from all that we can tell, was that this country, Iran, was doing pretty amazing things. Not that everybody loved the Shah. The various presidents didn't get along with him very well. It was hardly this kind of puppet master relationship that it's often caricatured as. But aside from that, the understanding was that from a statistical point of view and from every other indication, Iran seemed to be going great guns for a period, mostly through the 60s. For more than a decade, they had a a GDP rate of increase of 9.8% per year, astonishing. The Shah seemed to be enacting reforms. Whether he really did and to what extent is a different question, but that was the belief, the chosen belief. And things seemed to be going great. He had oil money to spend on the weapons that the U.S. wanted to sell. And for a policymaker to be able to have the luxury to believe that a difficult corner of the earth might not be a problem that he has to deal with all the time, that's something to be devoutly wished. And that's what happened. So with all of the other scandals, crises, and turmoil going on in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, the Carter administration, by and large, at the policymaking level, was more than happy to believe in the most optimistic scenarios.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. I completely agree with you about the socioeconomic development Iran experienced in the 60s and in the 70s. As a matter of fact, I think what Iran went through in the 1970s in terms of economic growth, in terms of educational advancement, in terms of freedom, civil liberties for women, etc., was unprecedented and unique in the modern history of Iran. It hasn't even been repeated. But I want to go back to the important point you made about the fact that there were a lot of Americans who knew what was going on in Iran, but they were ignored. You are one of the few American scholars on Iran, on U.S.-Iran policy, that has actually visited Iran a number of times. And I have to tell you, one of the best academic investments I've ever had was when I went to Iran a few years ago, 25 years ago, and I bought every single book that was published by the radical students who stormed the American embassy and confiscated all those documents. There are about 60 of them, and I have read, frankly, most of them. And I have to tell you, they are a fantastic source, and there are so many brilliant analyses by Americans who were in Iran, who knew Iranian society, who were in contact with different sectors of Iranian societies, but they were politically ignored by the policymakers in Washington precisely because of the point you made. Iran was seen as a major pillar for containing the Soviet Union, period. So the US decided, I'm not going to care about what happens in Iran internally. As long as the Shah is with us strategically, we're fine. Now I want to go to the third area, which I know you have done a book about, and it is one of the most, in my evaluation, one of the most intriguing and fascinating episode in the history of U.S.-Iran relations, and that is what happened in the mid-1980s between the Reagan administration and the Iranian government, something that came to be known as the Iran-Contra affairs. So would you summarize for the audience, please? And by the way, I have my students from my graduate seminar on Middle East politics. I want to welcome them to the event. Would you summarize for all of us what was the goal of the U.S. when they engaged in this exchange of American hostages in Lebanon in return for selling missiles and other missiles to the Islamic Republic of Iran?
It's an amazing story, and there's so much more there than a lot of people realize. They think it's just a crazy political scandal, but it really tells you a lot about the U.S.-Iran relationship, and certain things worked there that that would shock people, I think. But what was it about? I think that there were three main factors involved. The first was the hostage saga that was continuing in Lebanon, as you pointed out. Ronald Reagan was the president. He had succeeded Jimmy Carter, who had, failed miserably in his attempt to resolve the crisis in Iran. The Iranians kind of very cheekily waited literally until the last minute of his presidency, in fact, into the Reagan presidency, before they released the hostages. It was such a burning, humiliating moment for the Americans, and it stuck with Reagan as it did with everybody else. So Reagan was very sensitive to this, to the human tragedy that was involved, but also very much to the political side of things. He did not want to see yellow ribbons around trees around the United States, such as became a symbol of the Iran hostage crisis. So he was determined to try to bring home the probably 7, 8, 9, or 10, Americans who were being held at the time. And so when an opportunity came up to actually negotiate with the Iranians directly and find a way to possibly bring about their release, he jumped at it, in spite of the advice of his senior advisors. So Reagan himself and the hostage crisis were one factor. The second factor was the Iran-Iraq war that had broken out just before he came into office in September 1980. Why was that a factor? Because Iran was on everybody's bad list in the world. They were, just nobody wanted to deal with them except for sort of fringe or extreme states. So all of a sudden, when they are confronted with a very well-armed, sophisticated Iraqi military, all they have is access to sort of rusting American equipment from the Shah's days that they had not really maintained very well. They didn't have spare parts for. They didn't have as many pilots as they used to because they, decapitated the military for questions of loyalty and so on. So they were in a real bind and needed, above all, to find sources for weapons. Well, there happens to be a huge gray market out there in the world for sophisticated weapons, missiles, as well as, handguns and grenades and so on. But what the Iranians really needed to counter the Iraqi forces were anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft missiles. The contact was made between Iranian, middlemen and Israelis, because the Israelis had their own stores of these weapons because they had bought them from the Americans. And this comes to the third main factor, Israel. Israel has been a player in Iran for a long, long time, and their role here is night and day at odds with their position now in terms of the Islamic Republic. Back then, the powers that be were very interested in trying to reestablish connections with certain elements inside Iran, and they approached the Americans, the National Security Advisor, Robert McFarlane, to see if the U.S. would be interested in engaging in some kind of exchange that would bring hostages out, that would provide missiles to the so-called moderates inside Iran, and who knows what kinds of benefits would flow from that. So when you had that mix of a crisis in terms of hostages, a president who was really anxious to bring them home, a serious need on Iran's part, and a means to address both of those other issues through Israel initially, then that was the formula that worked.
Again, based on the documents you have seen, and I know I've read your stuff, and you have said it a number of times that you don't believe everything has been out yet. As a matter of fact, we know that Oliver North shredded a lot of documents, and he probably shredded the most sensitive documents. So we might never know what's going on. But based on limited documents that have been declassified, what would you say was the ultimate? We know why the Iranians were doing this, but was it really the release of the hostages, the ultimate desire, goal of the Reagan administration, or was it something more broad than that?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it gets into some nuance here, because as always is the case in any of these issues that we're talking about, or in any policy area, whatever your answer is to the question depends on who you're talking about. So in this case, if you're talking about some of the president's advisors, Reagan's advisors, like McFarlane or Graham Fuller at the CIA and other sort of strategists, they were especially interested in trying to find an opening back into Iran because it was such an important country. And so there was an element to it that involved trying to lay the foundation for a future relationship. And when you read, it's amazing that you can read some of the transcripts of their negotiations in Iran. And my co-author and I have reproduced several pages of those transcripts because the Americans recorded them. I'm sure the Iranians did too. And they transcribed them. And you can see that there are times when they talk about the need to get past the hostages so that we can get to the real issues and so on. So I don't doubt that there were people who thought that that was really the prize here. But if you're talking about the president himself and the president who runs the show, especially someone like Reagan, that would have been fine, but he was all about the hostages. And that we have that from some of his advisors who have said that, as well as some of the internal documents that they never thought would be declassified. So I think they're pretty credible.
It seems to me, again, based on reading the Iranian sources, your work and other interpretations of the event, even in that Iran-Contra affairs, the question of the Soviet Union, the context of the Cold War played a key role. I remember reading in one of the documents, perhaps it was in your book, where one of the main players was talking about, actually I read it in a document released by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, and they said that McFarlane told the Iranians that we are very concerned about the Russian intentions in Iran. We are selling you these weapons because if we don't, we believe the Russians are going to sell them to you, and we don't want that to happen. So that kind of mentality, I think, not only was the key factor in the coup of 1953, not only was a factor in the way they interpreted the revolution, but it also played a major role in the Iran-Contra affairs. My last question, before I introduce our surprise guest, is about the question I always ask my good students at the end of the class or at the end of their submission of their term paper. So what? So we looked at all these seminal events. Do you think we can learn anything from them so that we can begin to move toward a more normal, less antagonistic relations between our two countries?
Well, a huge question, and as a quasi-historian, I'd rather look at the past and see what we can find out from there rather than predict. But you've asked the question in a perfect way, which is what can we learn from the past? And there is a tremendous amount in the documents that we've been going through for this book, Worlds Apart. There's a lot of material there that shows you can kind of trace the arc of enlightenment on the part of American officials when they start with Jimmy Carter. Poor Jimmy Carter, accident of history, comes in at a time when the first Islamic Republic is about to be born, and nobody on planet Earth knows what to do about that. So you have utter ignorance and fog there, and you gradually work your way through where Reagan, through just sheer bluster and force of personality, decrees we are going to talk to these people. And so they find a way to get pretty high up. We know that the top Iranian leadership was on board with this, and they were keeping track of what was happening. They knew McFarlane was in Tehran. Rafsanjani's memoir is just fantastic on that. So then you move to George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, who also tries to get hostages out, and he knows. He's learned a few things. Keep it quiet. Find a trusted intermediary. Don't go for this Manager Gorbachev guy who is so untrustworthy and caused such problems. So he goes through the UN Secretary General's office, establishes contact with Rafsanjani. They go from there. Doesn't really work out, but that's another story. Clinton comes into office, at first wants nothing to do with Iran. Then when Khatami gets elected in 1997, he decides this is a potential breakthrough period for us. And so he tries to figure out, how can I make contact with these folks? And decides that the way to do it is to write a letter to Khatami, his counterpart. Good idea. Communicate directly president to president. Problem is, Khatami is not in charge. And so that attempt blows up as well. Bush 43, forget it, not interested in Iran particularly, except maybe to a greater degree in the second term. But that's a different kind of dynamic. Then you come to Obama, and a lot of people disagree with Obama's policy, his ideas about the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and his whole concept of approaching and treating an adversary with some level of dignity that a lot of, let's say, the Bush 43 advisors would have wanted nothing to do with. But by then, Obama and his advisors had figured out, okay, we need to communicate directly, but don't write to the president, who's Ahmadinejad, write to the supreme leader. He's the boss. And what happens? They immediately get a response back. Other events get in the way and ruin things for them, but they had that idea right. They also had very accurately an assessment of how to treat the Iranians, which means treat them as a major regional power, but don't think they're 10 feet tall. They've got big problems. Treat them with respect. This is the word that you know very well, much better than I, that this is so important to Iranian officials. They want to be treated with respect. But don't forget that they also are doing these things that the rest of the world finds abhorrent. So you've got to find the right balance between acknowledging reality, but also working towards the potential for improving relations. It's a much more involved story, but as I say, when you go through these documents, you can see sort of piece by piece how different presidential administrations are sort of learning from previous mistakes and putting things together. If I had time, I would list a few things that I think we need to look for to make advances from the point that we find ourselves today. But don't know what our time is.
Much, Malcolm, but I have to give you a huge compliment for A, sticking with the time that we agreed on, and B, more importantly, for the clarity of your thinking, of your thought. And you write clearly also, which usually, I believe, clear writing is a sign of a clear of thinking and thought. So you were fantastic.
Well, now,
I have the pleasure of introducing you, Malcolm, to somebody you might know. And his name is Kian, and he is your son.
yes,
And I want to welcome Kian to our conversation. Welcome, Kian.
Thank you.
Yes.
I really appreciate being here and getting to have a chance to talk to you both. It's great.
Fantastic. Kian is has co-authored with his dad and others, and he knows quite a bit about the Middle East and Iran, and he works at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And if there are students or serious researchers in the audience who are interested in documents, in real material about the history of Iran, politics of Iran, politics of the Middle East, I think you need to pay close attention to the questions I'm going to ask Kian now. Kian, please tell me a little bit about the kind of work you do at the Wilson Center in Washington.
Absolutely. So I work in the History and Public Policy program. Our office within the Woodrow Wilson Center actually does very similar work to what my father does at the National Security Archive. We're a project aimed at providing access to once classified primary source materials, with our focus being on archives around the world. These records take several forms, but a lot of it comes from national archives within countries related to the Cold War or nuclear history. These documents, once they are obtained by scholars that we work in partnership with, are published through our digital archive. It's digitalarchive.org. And we supplement these document collections with published analyses through our blog, our working paper series, and in-person conferences and workshops. My work specifically within that program is to increase our coverage of Middle Eastern documents and archives. I think we've started to get into this a little bit in the conversation already, but the Middle Eastern perspective we feel is largely missing from especially Western historiography. The access to materials are limited for a number of different reasons, but my program is hoping to establish partnerships with local institutions, local archives, and help build out the world's access to the archival materials within the Middle East specifically.
I know that the book that you are part of, Worlds Apart, is being published soon, and it has used Iranian documents. What kind of documents have you used for that book?
So we have a number of different types of documents, especially speeches from Khomeini and Mousavi, for example. We have communique number 1 from the students who stormed the embassy and during the hostage crisis, sort of representing their kind of front-facing voices and the official voices of the Iranians involved in these negotiations and these periods of U.S.-Iran relations. But there are a couple that I would really like to kind of draw attention to, and hopefully future readers of the book will find enjoyable. And they are a letter from Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri to Khomeini during the Iran-Iraq War in 1985, and a speech by Hassan Rouhani in 2005 to the Iranian Supreme National Security Council. I think these two documents, more than probably any other within the book, and probably would match much of what's out there already, kind of show an inside look into how the Iranian government functions, especially at the highest level, and gives a really honest look into how they interact with each other. The Montazeri speech is a letter to Khomeini, essentially asking him to go to at least negotiations with Iraq and bring a ceasefire to the end of the war, which at this point is already into pretty serious attrition, war of attrition. And he's sticking his neck out there and kind of representing himself as much more of a moderate. Now, he's absolutely still the revolutionary that he was 6 years ago, but we really get to see how he interacts with Khomeini, how he defines the relationship, and even we can get some insight into the struggle for power and authority between the IRGC and the army. The speech by Rouhani is great because it's just a bluntness that you cannot see when you're just reading newspaper clippings or listening to speeches, public speeches by the Iranian representatives. He honestly, openly admits to lying to the IAEA about the nuclear program, basically saying that they thought they would get away with it. And then China, it turns out, has been feeding this information to the IAEA the whole time. And he sort of shrugs it off and says, so we have to be honest at this point and move forward. I think this is sort of what my project is trying to get at, and create more opportunity for the rest of the world to see how the Islamic Republic truly functions and not just how it presents itself.
Let me make one point, one important. When I am looking at my cell phone, I'm not checking my email. I am checking the questions that are sent to me from our producer. So this is not that
no problem on my end at all.
Yeah,
I'm a millennial, so it's sort of secondhand.
Tell me about the documents that people can see on your website. First of all, tell us where that website is, and tell us what kind of documents we can find on that website. Sure.
So our digital archives website is digitalarchive.org. So it's a very straightforward name, and it's a resource. Right now, we have tens of thousands of documents relating to any number of subjects from the post-war world, nuclear history, Cold War relations, North Korea, different subjects. Within the Middle East, we have about more than 1,400 documents from sources relating to the Middle East. They're not all from Middle Eastern archives. And relating to Iran in particular, we have more than 300 documents that are available right now online. They relate primarily to the Tudeh Party and their interactions with the Soviet Union. But we also have some pretty phenomenal records from the now defunct Conflict Records Research Center, which are the Iraqi state papers. And those relate to the Iran-Iraq War, which is a woefully understudied subject.
And this would be available on that website, right?
Yes, so, for free download access. Have at it.
Do you have the entire documents about the papers that be captured from the Iraqis? Because I have the print version of it, and it's fascinating. But I didn't know that you have it available online.
So we have just a small selection of these documents that were published on our website in 2012 when the CRRC was still available, still running. And we did a conference with Bruce Montgomery and the CRRC folks to sort of publish and advertise a small selection. So the vast majority of those documents are still unavailable or in Iraq right now. But if you want a little bit of insight, a small taste of what was available, we have those available, yeah.
One of the most fascinating part of those documents, the one that I have seen, is the part about Saddam Hussein's assessment and evaluation of Iran, and especially his intelligence agencies, how they looked at Iran, how they looked at the Iranians, how they were analyzing Iranian politics. And when I read it, I was not surprised why Saddam Hussein had invaded Iran in 1980. Those guys hated the Persians. They really, really hated the Persians. Let me ask you, we have 4 or 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you the question about the difficulties that you or anyone can encounter when they want to access to Iranian sources for the research. What are some of the obstacles, and what do you suggest how we can bypass them or overcome those obstacles?
Sure. So about a year ago, I published a series of blog posts on our blog Sources and Methods. There was a survey of Middle East archives. I interviewed a bunch of scholars who have worked in archives within the Middle East, and tried to create a little bit of a resource for scholars who, like myself, are sort of neophytes in the field and just building out research now of what to sort of expect if you want to go to these countries and these national archives. Iran was one of those countries that I looked at, and I think it represents such a unique, even within the Middle East, opportunity and difficulty for scholars. It does not have a declassification law, but it does have a national archive that is open to foreigners. I think we can understand the difficulties for Americans, especially these days, just even getting to Iran. But if you do get there, it's obviously an incredibly friendly place and incredibly open, and it does allow the opportunity for research if you know what you're doing. And I think the biggest takeaway of my interviews and sort of my interactions with scholars and archivists in the region is you need to be patient, and you need to commit a lot of time. You need to learn the language, you need to become familiar with the archive, you need to develop relationships, and you need to be prepared to make multiple trips because, and this is true across the region from at least my experience and my understanding of through these interviews, it's a deeply personal thing to go to these archives and to work with these archivists and get to know them. And you have to build out a lot of trust. And I think it's a great kind of parallel with the diplomatic relations of the US and Iran, where the issue is always just comes down to time. There's not enough time. Everybody's trying to force things. And if you want real development, and if you want real growth, and this counts both ways for research and for diplomatic ties, you have to spend the time and you have to kind of commit to it. So
yeah, Kian, I was telling your dad a few days ago in a telephone conversation that my blessed mom used to tell us that Iran is like a big onion. It has different layers, And unless and until you have tasted at least 6 or 7 of those layers, you have no idea what kind of onion you're eating. And that is one of the fundamental problems we have with Iranian, so-called Iranian experts and Iranian scholarships. They don't speak the language. They have never been to the country. They don't know anything about Iranian history. They start with what has happened to Iran 4 days ago. And they think based on that, they can give you a good analysis. My last question, the one that I am most interested in, is what are some of the best places where we can find documents related to Iran, and particularly for my interest, for Iranian foreign policy?
So other than digitalarchive.org, which I highly recommend to all of your listeners, there are a number of different archives that scholars can use as we frame it to triangulate the work. If Iran is inaccessible to you, as it is for many of us, you have to work with the countries that Iran has worked with. So again, in our archive, we have a lot of documents from the former Soviet archives, Argaspi, Argani. But there's the Qatar Digital Library, which is publishing thousands of documents online for free for anyone to visit. Different international archives, the Indian National Archives represent a lot of promise, the Russian archives, as I mentioned, but even countries that you wouldn't expect, like Japan, have documents relating to their interactions with Iran. And I think a good scholar with unlimited time and resources would try to access all of these and try to build out around. Within Iran, I think you would be surprised, maybe not you, but maybe some of your listeners, how much material there actually is being developed within the country. I think the Institute for Iranian Contemporary Historical Studies and the Islamic Revolution Document Center are a couple that I covered in my article that are doing great work within the country. And even the IRGC publishes documents. But these are all in Farsi, and obviously you have to take certain things with a grain of salt. But it just speaks to the value that's being lost by not accessing stuff within the country. You mentioned all of the books that were written by the students that you brought back. It's not just the documents that are missing, it's the scholarship. So I would say build out as much around as you can, and then where possible, try to get something from in.
I have one final question that before I ask. I want to ask the audience, please, if you have any questions, go to the chat room, send your questions, and those questions are going to be forwarded to me through my cell phone, and I will read them. My last question, and it probably is going to surprise you. You're quite articulate. You are extremely intelligent. How did you end up doing what your dad has done and has mastered the art? Was it his influence? How did you end up going into this exciting and important enterprise?
Sheer nepotism. No, honestly, it was a lot of growing up around my father and his friends and colleagues that kind of made history, to use a cliche, come alive for me. But it was also my grandfather, Manucher Afzal, who was an academic himself and really had such a just strong passion for Iran and Iranian history in particular that it just really felt natural to kind of follow that same thread and try to live up to his interests and kind of follow his footsteps.
Now, Kian, where you got that dark hair.
Yeah, exactly.
Dark Persian eyes. Now we know the rest of the story. All right, fantastic. It is exactly 8 o'clock, and please stay with us, Kian. And I'm going to ask a number of questions from both of you, and whoever wants to answer it can do so. The first questions come from Dunya, a medical student here at USF. And the question is, considering the deteriorating relationship between Iran and Israel during the time of the Iran-Iraq war, what was the logic behind Israel's sale of weapons and missiles to Iran? You described the American logic. What was the Israeli logic, rationale for selling those weapons to Iran?
It was not so different. I mean, the approach that was made directly was by David Kimche, who was an advisor to, he was a high official in the foreign ministry, and he approached Robert McFarlane in mid-1985 with this idea that he had, based on interactions with some of his associates in Iran, in Israel, where they suggested that there were elements inside the Iranian system that were open to, if not restoring things to the way they were during the Shah's day, at least to having a connection, maintaining a connection with Israel and with the United States. And Israel's own interests, his particular interests, related largely to the ability to have an inroad into the Nizam, into the Iranian system, where they had been shut out completely by the revolution. Most of their contacts had been disrupted, and they were blind, as many other nations' intelligence services were. So the Israelis wanted to know what's going on over there. This is a very important country for them too. There was also the question of the situation with Iranian Jews. How were they being treated? Was there anything that should be of concern? So there was a natural desire to sort of have a way to either establish contact or just keep tabs on what was happening with Jews in Iran. And those were the main reasons. There were also, in these kinds of interstate relations, economics are always important. And so Israel and the United States both make a lot of money selling arms. We all know about the Shah's relationship with Nixon. The Israelis sell a lot of arms too. So, and it's not just chump change. It can amount to millions, if not billions, of dollars, and so that becomes a very important issue too.
What a lot of people don't know, you and I, Kian, know that there is a relatively large population of Iranian Jews who live in Israel, who left Iran after the revolution. We had perhaps the highest concentration of Jews living in Iran during the pre-revolutionary period. Unfortunately, after the Islamic Revolution and the some anti-Semite policies of the Islamic Republic, many of these Jews were forced to leave Iran, and they ended up going to Israel. And for me, the most fascinating part of it is that a former Israeli president is an Iranian-born Jewish man, and also a former defense minister of Israel was also born in Iran. Kian, would you like to add anything to this based on your research?
Honestly, I think that covers most of it. I think that it does remind me of an anecdote of my mother's growing up in Iran and always seeing the unmarked El Al flight in the airport. I think people kind of underestimate how much these relations, how far they go back between Israel and Iran. So that's the one thing that I can add is it's not out of nothing. It's not out of the blue that these interactions were going on.
I have a question from Marcel, who is a French gentleman and one of our capable and intelligent students in the seminar. What can be found about the logic of the embargo policy of the U.S. toward Iran and any assessment of its success? I suppose we can cover both the economic sanctions as well as the arms embargo imposed on Iran immediately after the attack on the American embassy back in 1979, November of 1979. Either one of you can address the issue.
Yeah.
I'll default to you.
Okay. So if the question is what purpose does it serve? Was that the idea?
What is the logic, and what has been the logic and the impact these economic sanctions and arms embargoes on Iran?
I'm not the world's expert. It would also take many hours to give a full answer. My short answer is the logic is that it's part of the larger discussion that policymakers have been having in recent years and for many years, actually, about whether sanctions do any good. And there's a lot of disagreement over this, but as we all know, very often our own government resorts to sanctions. So there must be a lot of people who think that they do some good. I would say that there are some recognizable results. The arms embargo with Iran is one case, and I think it's clear that it did have its effects. Iran, for 8 years in its war with Iraq, was forced to sort of scour, the back alleys of the world arms market to try to find things. It was not an easy circumstance for them. The economic embargoes, the sanctions, have been getting more and more sophisticated over the years as technology has improved and as intelligence operations make it easier to impose what they call smart sanctions and highly targeted sanctions of different kinds. Those have some popularity inside different presidential administrations, in large part because they represent something short of an act of war. Frankly, it's Iran is such a difficult case for those inside our government who really want to take it to Tehran and teach them a lesson. Iran is too big, powerful, resourceful, and dangerous, frankly, for them to be able to pull that off. So sanctions are a recognized and to some degree effective enough solution, if that's even the right word, it's certainly politically popular. It makes it look like you're doing something tough when you impose sanctions. But now we get into nuances and in terms of their effectiveness. On one hand, I think that there are a lot of statistics that say that, yes, Iran has really been squeezed tight by the latest rounds over the last few years. But if you look back to the early 1950s, when the British imposed oil and other embargoes on Iran, and in more recent times, I think that you will find that there are serious economists and historians who say that, in fact, the overall impact or the overall result would have to be called something of a failure, because Iran has continued to operate. It's continued to, if not be in the black, to survive economically. It has not, gone into bankruptcy. They continue to find ways around these sanctions and to maintain themselves. Life is hard there, but it's not nearly as bad as many in this government or in previous governments wished.
Kian, would you like to add anything to what Malcolm said?
Just very briefly, I think another cost that is not often considered or at least hasn't been mentioned yet is the taxing effect of the sanctions on our relations with our allies. For instance, if you look at Europe and some of the issues that we've had, bringing them on board with sanctioning Iran, it does come at a cost to us. It's not a free punishment for Iran or a free action. It does come with its own weight.
Quickly, especially in reference to what Malcolm said, one of the major consequences of the arms embargo that was imposed on Iran before the start of the Iran-Iraq war was that Iran, because it couldn't buy American weapons, because it couldn't buy, frankly, any kind of weapons because of the US pressure, was the development of an indigenous, very small military industrial complex. Mm-hmm. They say that necessity is the mother of invention. A few weeks after the beginning of the war, Saddam Hussein sent missiles to one of the Iranian cities and killed about 45 to 50 people. Iran at that time could not respond with a missile. They didn't have it. So what happened is that they sent about 12 or 13 young revolutionary guards to Syria and asked Syria to teach them how to actually build missiles. And the Syrians responded positively. They trained them and they went back. And one of those guys, one of those young guys, I think he was about 28 or 29 at the time, went back and established really the foundation of Iranian missile technology. And that technology has grown in the past 38 years. And as you know, today, Iran has one of the largest and most sophisticated missile technologies in the Middle East. So there is these embargoes have hurt Iran, but also have pushed Iran toward independence, toward developing indigenous industries.
Well, as you well know, just to add 2 seconds to that, Khamenei, the supreme leader, takes great pride and uses that as a rallying cry to develop indigenous industries in various areas as a counterweight. And it's not just missiles. That's a really important point. But it also, you can point to the chemical weapons manufacturing and even the restarting of the nuclear program from the Shah's days as both outgrowths of the Iran-Iraq war. Not that the Iranians used the chemical weapons. I don't think there's hard evidence of that. But certainly the idea that we need to be self-sufficient and to the point of developing nuclear weapons has been an argument that Iranians have publicly stated.
You can add to it. You can add to the list of the industries you referred to, missile industries, the drone, building of drones. Very recently, the commander of CENTCOM had an interview, I think testified before the Congress, and said that because of these drones, many of them coming from Iran, given to the Yemenis Houthis, the dominance the U.S. had in the air is no longer as absolute as it used to be. So you are absolutely right. The next questions come from Don, and many Iranians insist that the U.S. provided chemical weapons to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. Why were they selling arms to Iran and helping Iraq at the same time?
Yeah, your mind explodes at some of the logic of these things. I wrote a paper about that, about the one particular aspect, which was the intelligence sharing, because at a certain time, the United States was sharing sensitive intelligence with both Iran and Iraq at the exact same time in the 1980s. On chemical weapons, we organized a conference that was extremely interesting. We've done a number of these before. We call them critical oral histories, where it's not just a one-on-one oral history with a former policymaker, but a whole group of them all around the table where they talk. The scholars don't really say much except to try to keep to the facts. But you try to get people who were used to be adversaries and sit at the table and discuss what happened, what was the history that they were living through and creating, and so on. It was very hard to get Iranians to come to the table, but we did manage to get some who are in this country who were very helpful in terms of helping us understand things. But this one event that we had, and Kian's organization has also sponsored these kinds of conferences, and the transcripts are available. So this one event was about the Iran-Iraq war, and it featured mostly American intelligence officials and diplomats of very substantial roles that they played. And the consensus was, from the documents and from the discussions, which I think were quite candid, that technically speaking, the U.S. did not supply chemical weapons to Iraq. It's an important distinction. They did, however, provide targeting information, battlefield intelligence, and if you read the interviews of a couple of retired Defense Intelligence Agency officials, sort of helped even more specifically with the Iraqi forces to identify where to fire chemical weapons and what the impact might be, that kind of thing. It is just a dark and heinous chapter in world history. The participants in our event were abashed and had a lot of really harsh lessons to give to the rest of us about what happens in those kinds of difficult circumstances. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Kian, would you like to add anything to this sensitive and sad story?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the one addition that I can make is to say that this is also sort of normal, that this sort of issue comes up. We talk about the pragmatist party within Iran, but I think the kind of deeply pragmatic, if you want to put it that way, thinking of U.S. leaders is pretty clear throughout this relationship. One example is in a Black Room report that we have in our book, where Carter and his National Security Council are considering what options are available to them. And there's a level of kind of very cynical thinking that is going on even then. And, if these lines that the U.S. is drawing that they don't technically cross. So one example is mining the Gulf and things like that. They never do it, but they do consider it. So this type of action, this type of thinking is pretty common, and I don't think the U.S. is unique in that way. But I think that this is a pretty common thread throughout the relationship.
Well, I think, as Malcolm suggested, there is overwhelming evidence, cannot be even disputed anymore, that Iraq used chemical weapons on a massive scale. I believe, and I have studied this, and I try to be as objective as I can. I believe there were two reasons why Iran could not win the war against Iraq. By 1970, by 1986, 87, Iran had captured the Fao Island Peninsula. And that was a major, major victory for Iran. They kept it for about 2 years. And if they would have been able to maintain it, they could have moved toward the port of Basra. And if they would have captured that, that would have been the end of the war. The two factors that prevented Iran from, and there were a number of other factors, but two of them related to our discussion. One was the extensive use of chemical weapons by Saddam Hussein, knowing that he can do so with impunity. That is the critical element. He knew that he can get away with it, and therefore he used it on massive scale. And second, something a lot of people don't pay enough attention to, is that America became directly involved in the war against Iran in the Persian Gulf during the so-called Tankers War. So exactly, and this is not a coincidence, I believe. The peninsula, the Fao Peninsula, was recaptured by the Iraqis exactly. I'm talking about maybe 24 hours, 48 hour difference, exactly as the Americans started going after the small Iranian navy and destroyed 2/3 of it in a few days. So that is a very important consideration to have in mind. The last question is from Andrew. When Khomeini returned to Iran, he was accompanied by a number of international journalists. What were the expectations for Khomeini? How did he meet or diverge from those expectations? I guess the way I can rephrase this so that both of you can answer. What did Khomeini promise and what did he deliver? Because there was a major difference between what he promised in Paris before he went to Iran and what he delivered. But before you answer this, let me add a footnote to it. Don't forget, even politicians in the most democratic settings, they promise a lot and they can deliver very little of what they promise. But with that in mind, would you tackle that question?
I'll go first this time.
Sure. I think from my understanding, I think it's very unclear throughout the early part of the revolution, and especially immediately after Khomeini arrives, what he's aiming for. I think certainly the Americans were unaware or completely underestimated his ability to pull anything off. We have the documentation of them repeatedly saying that that his government surely isn't going to last, that he's a medieval thinker, and that there's no way that this could happen. I think with Velayat Fahi and his kind of thinking on those lines, you could definitely draw conclusions that he had these absolutely massive grand ambitions, not just for the country, but for himself. Unfortunately, I am not aware of any documents to kind of prove his planning outside of his own website. But in my mind, I think there was a lot of, as you mentioned, kind of political talk and sort of over promising, but it's not so much over promising as creating a wish list. And I think everyone, including Khomeini, were likely surprised by how much he was able to accomplish and how much he was able to achieve in at least his thinking, or how much it even developed beyond what he was thinking initially.
You mentioned something really fascinating about how we didn't know much about Ayatollah Khomeini. Both of you know that in the last month or so of the Shah's rule, President Carter sent General Hoyze to go to Iran and assess the situation in Iran to see if there is a possibility that he can organize the army to stage a coup, or whether the army is even capable of staging a coup. Anyhow, he admitted that until he was called by the White House to go to Iran, he had never heard of Ayatollah Khomeini. I read some, and I could be completely wrong. It could be one of those stuff you read on the internet. So my source is the internet. The book Ayatollah Khomeini had written in 1971 called The Islamic Government, the one that I read when I was in California. His book was not available at the CIA library. So they even were surprised. They had no idea. They obviously heard of Khomeini because he became a major figure in the 1963 uprising against the Shah, but they had no idea about his views, about his perspective. So there is considerable ignorance about Iran in this country. Well, let me summarize everything that I have heard from you. I had the pleasure of listening to an accomplished, well-published author in Malcolm. And I've always had the pleasure of listening and learning from a rising scholar in Kian. So thank you both for enlightening us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and thought with us. And I really hope that soon, when we begin to have our events on our campus, I can invite both of you to come to the campus, meet our supporters and friends, meet the people who have behind the scene made this program possible. So with that, thank you to both of you. And if you don't have any comments to make, that would bring us to the end of the program. Would you like to make any closing comments?
No, just a big thank you. This was a real honor. It was a delightful conversation. I learned something from it, and I've known about your work for a long time, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be included on this program, and I look forward to continuing this connection. But also, and I'm sure Kian would agree, that both of us would urge all of your students and your listeners, viewers, to check out our websites, because the materials that we have on there are free and I think really enlightening. And there's no better way to try to figure out what's going on, to cut through all the spin and the politics and so on, than to look back at the history, look at the historical record, and then make up your own mind.
Thank you. And would you like to make a closing comment?
Sure. I would reiterate everything that my father said, and thank you truly for letting me join in. It was great to be a surprise guest for the first time. That was a lot of fun. So thank you for letting me join in on a great discussion.
Thank you both. And with that, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being patient and listening to our conversation. And if you're interested in getting information about our center, just send your email through the chat icon, and we will send you the information about our future events. With that, have a wonderful evening and good night.